I recently sat down for coffee with an acquaintance who, on paper, is absolutely crushing it. He's the poster child for the modern hustle, the curated feed, the perfect pivot stories, and a vocabulary full of high-performance buzzwords. He spent 20 minutes telling me how he's scaling and optimizing, his face lit up with that practiced high-energy glow we're all taught to admire. To any observer, he looked like the very definition of a strong, successful man. But then his phone buzzed. It was a simple follow-up text from a client asking about a minor project delay. In an instant, that polished exterior didn't just crack, it disintegrated. His hand started shaking slightly as he scrolled through a dozen previous threads, his eyes darting back and forth as if he were looking for an exit. He wasn't just stressed, he was paralyzed. He was desperately trying to remember which version of the truth he had sold this specific client, terrified that a single honest answer would bring the whole house of cards down. The giddy excitement from moments before was replaced by a frantic, hunted look. Watching him, I realized he wasn't actually building a career. He was managing a massive amount of structural debt. He had lied to avoid a small conflict weeks ago, and now he was paying a heavy cognitive tax just to keep the narrative consistent. He looked exhausted, not from the work, but from the relentless maintenance of the mask. It was a vivid display of a fundamental law of human physics. When you lie to protect your image, you stop being the builder of your life and start becoming its sentry, constantly looking over your shoulder. It made me wonder, how many of us are building palaces on a foundation of sand? We spend so much energy polishing the scuffs of reality that we neglect the only thing that actually provides stability. Because the truth is simple, if a bit inconvenient. You are only as strong as you are honest. When we stop hiding, we stop being afraid of being found out, and that lack of fear is the only real form of power.
I have observed this exact phenomenon repeatedly throughout my career. And the observation you make is profound. The maintenance of a false image is not merely a moral failing. It's a highly measurable, exhausting cognitive burden. Our purpose in this deep dive is to conduct a really thorough exploration of the architecture of integrity. We're going to examine the cognitive tax of deception, the massive organizational and personal costs of inauthenticity, and the undeniable strength that comes from radical honesty. Because I have found that when we dissect the structural realities of modern professional life, the illusion of the protected self is consistently revealed as a primary source of systemic failure.
Yeah, and to understand the sheer scale of this cognitive tax in a corporate landscape, I want to detail a situation involving a CEO named Marcus. He operated in a highly competitive tech hub in Seattle. Marcus was leading his executive team through a pretty brutal market downturn. For months, the company had been aggressively spinning their financial stagnation as strategic consolidation.
Right, a classic pivot term.
Exactly. They were telling the board, the employees, the market, that this lack of growth was a deliberate pause. But the cognitive load required to maintain that narrative was killing them. Marcus realized that maintaining the lie required significantly more energy than actually fixing the underlying business. Every single meeting, every memo had to be carefully filtered through this false narrative of strategic consolidation. It was a staggering operational drain.
That phrase, cognitive load, is absolutely critical to isolate right from the start. When an individual, or an entire executive team for that matter, is forced to track the actual truth alongside a fabricated version of the truth, they are actively dividing their mental resources. The brain is quite literally working double time.
It's processing two realities at once.
Energy that should be directed toward problem-solving and strategic adaptation is instead squandered on narrative management. I have seen this exact dynamic paralyze entire organizations. Think about the mechanics of a single meeting under those conditions. The executives cannot simply react to data. They must first pass that data through a mental filter to ensure their reaction aligns with the strategic consolidation storyline. It creates a massive latency in decision-making.
I want to push on that for a second, though. If I'm sitting in Marcus's chair looking at a plunging revenue chart, my first instinct is self-preservation. Strategic consolidation sounds like exactly what a smart PR team would tell me to say to prevent a mass exodus of talent. So where is the line between necessary narrative management and this paralyzing delusion you're describing?
The line is drawn at internal reality versus external projection. It is one thing to present a measured front to the market while simultaneously executing a ruthless, honest turnaround internally. The structural debt occurs when the leader begins to force the internal team to operate within the fiction. Marcus wasn't just spinning the market. His executive team was forced to uphold the spin among themselves. That is where the cognitive tax bankrupts an operation. You cannot fix a machine if you are actively forbidding the mechanics from acknowledging which parts are broken. The team spends all its time protecting the leader's ego rather than addressing the failing product.
And the turning point for Marcus came when he finally dropped that facade. He walked into a boardroom and admitted plainly that their primary product line was failing. By doing this, he chose to shed the self-protection of being a perfect leader. Instead, he embraced what I would call the responsibility superpower. It was a radical move in a hyper-competitive environment that demands invulnerability. But the result was counterintuitive to everything we are taught about corporate posturing. By being radically honest about the mess, he didn't lose his team's respect. He regained their trust. In a culture that demands professionals fake it till they make it, his transparency acted as a massive release valve. It demonstrated that the truth isn't just an ethical choice. It becomes a distinct competitive advantage because brainpower is no longer wasted on memorizing a script.
I can draw a direct parallel to a personal anecdote that perfectly encapsulates the human response to this kind of radical honesty. I recently learned about a situation involving a 91-year-old father who had been dealing with a concerning medical issue for quite some time.
Oh.
He saw multiple doctors, and repeatedly, the medical professionals avoided giving him a direct, unvarnished diagnosis. They shied away from the hard truth, likely trying to spare him, or perhaps themselves, the discomfort of the moment.
Which is a very human instinct.
It is, but it's fundamentally unhelpful. When he finally saw a doctor who gave it to him straight, he was asked if the news was good. His reply was striking. He said, "No, but at least I know. Now I can do something about it and learn to live with it." I have found that this is precisely how employees feel when leadership finally drops the spin and delivers the straight truth. Even when the news is bad, the clarity is empowering. It restores agency.
That perfectly highlights a concept that dominates the modern workplace, which is the avoider boss. It is a staggering reality that 80% of people report having, or currently working for, a boss who actively shies away from honesty. They avoid being open, they avoid the discomfort of direct truth, and this avoidance has three massive systemic consequences.
The first consequence is the absolute erosion of trust. Without honesty, trust simply cannot grow. When leadership withholds the truth, the bonds that hold a culture together begin to crumble. Employees immediately sense when they are not being given the full story. I know of a specific event that illustrates this brilliantly, often referred to as the chair incident. Yes. A corporate leader was sent to a specific company site to announce a new, highly positive employee benefit. At other sites, this exact same announcement had been met with standing ovations and genuine excitement. But at this particular site, the moment the speaker finished, rows of employees literally stood up, held their chairs in the air, and yelled at the speaker to leave the stage.
That is an incredibly extreme reaction to objectively good news. If I am the executive on that stage, I am completely bewildered. What drives a workforce to reject a benefit so violently?
It was entirely driven by the historical context of that specific location. The site manager later explained that the employees there had lost all trust in leadership due to a long history of dishonesty and avoidance. Management had spent years dodging hard questions and sugarcoating bad news because the foundation of trust had been so thoroughly destroyed by past inauthenticity. Even positive, objectively truthful news was rendered completely unbelievable.
They assumed it was a trick.
Exactly. They assumed there was a hidden catch, a trap door behind the new benefit. That is the cost of the avoider boss. You lose the ability to effectively communicate anything at all. When your baseline is avoidance, your promises are viewed as threats.
The second massive consequence of the avoider boss is the creation of mistruths. Nature abhors a vacuum, and so does an employee base. When leaders fail to communicate with radical honesty, they leave a silence. Employees will inevitably fill that silence with their own assumptions, and human psychology dictates that those assumptions are almost always worse than reality. I have reviewed cases where a leadership team began holding closed-door meetings. When employees asked why, they were given a vague, avoidant explanation about discussing potential reorganizations.
That is a classic avoidance tactic.
Yep.
It attempts to placate without actually informing. The leader thinks they are diffusing the situation by giving a non-answer, but they are actually lighting a fuse.
And that single, vague explanation opened the floodgates of speculation. The mistruths multiplied rapidly, and within days, the accepted truth circulating throughout the entire office was that massive layoffs were imminent. People were convinced that entire departments were being slashed. The reality was nowhere near that severe. It was a minor reshuffling of reporting structures, but the damage was done. Transparency is the only mechanism that can stop rumors cold.
Which brings us to the third consequence, the severe hit to productivity. There is a phrase I utilize frequently when examining organizational design. Straight talk creates straight paths.
Straight talk creates straight paths.
When employees are not given the full truth, they are forced to navigate in the dark. Without clarity, they inevitably drift off course, wasting massive amounts of time and effort trying to find their way back. In the example of the closed-door meetings you just mentioned, the resulting layoff rumors caused a significant drop in productivity. Instead of executing their tasks, employees were consumed by conversations about what the rumors meant for their livelihoods. Brainpower was diverted from the work to managing the anxiety caused by the avoider boss.
This philosophy of radical honesty over avoidance is vividly demonstrated in the organizational model built by Patty McCord during her time defining the culture at Netflix. She pioneered a paradigm that fundamentally prioritized context over control. To understand this, we have to look at the genesis of this culture. Back in 2001, the company was facing a profound bust and was on the brink of bankruptcy. They were forced to lay off a significant portion of their workforce. But following that layoff, McCord realized something vital. Without the immense layers of bureaucratic opinions and approvals, the remaining team had vastly greater mobility for innovation. They didn't have to spend the majority of their time seeking permission.
I have analyzed her approach extensively, and it's a fascinating dismantling of 20th century corporate logic. McCord argued that preconceived ideas of policy, rigid rules, strict budgets, standardized annual reviews are simply too inflexible to capture the dynamic needs of a modern business landscape. She advocated for the total removal of these control mechanisms, but she did not advocate for anarchy. This is a crucial distinction. Instead, she posited a vital substitution. You replace rules, processes, and bureaucracy with clear, continuous communication about the context of the work to be done.
If I'm playing devil's advocate here, the idea of removing budgets, strict rules, and annual reviews sounds terrifying. If I don't have a rigid process in place, how do I stop an employee from expensing a luxury vacation or completely ignoring their core duties? It feels like an invitation to absolute chaos.
It feels like chaos. Only if you assume employees are inherently untrustworthy or incompetent. McCord's model operates on the assumption that you have hired adults who are capable of logic. If you provide them with the ultimate context, the company's goals, the financial realities, the strategic objectives, they will make decisions aligned with those goals. The control is replaced by extreme clarity. If someone does abuse the system, you deal with that specific individual, rather than burdening the entire organization with draconian rules that stifle the high performers.
That is where the famous Netflix culture deck comes into play. It wasn't just an orientation pamphlet given to new hires and forgotten. It was a living document used by every member of the team. Departmental heads would use it every quarter to frame their presentations. The critical mechanism here is that communication must flow multidirectionally. It flows from, amongst, and between new hires and veteran leaders. And a cornerstone of this multidirectional communication is the absolute necessity of face-to-face feedback.
This is where we see the intense contrast between hard truths and half-truths. McCord argues that half-truths usually stem from a leader attempting to distill or soften company problems when communicating to staff. They think they are protecting the team from stress. But softening information is actually far worse than delivering a hard truth. Half-truths induce anxiety because the team instinctively knows information is being withheld. They can sense the cognitive dissonance. Eventual surprises are inevitable, and when the full truth finally emerges, trust is shattered. Being radically honest from the beginning allows the team to process their initial reactions and then immediately adapt.
But face-to-face feedback is incredibly daunting. McCord also provides a sharp critique of anonymous feedback surveys, which are a staple in most modern HR departments. She argues that truth must come from a person, not from anonymity. But am I a junior employee? The idea of looking a senior executive in the eye and giving them critical feedback is terrifying. Doesn't anonymity provide a necessary safety net for power dynamics?
It provides a safety net that actively breeds dysfunction. If a team member receives anonymous feedback, they cannot contextualize it. They don't know the source, the specific circumstances, or the nuances of the observation. Was this feedback from someone who worked closely with me on a critical project, or someone who passed me the hallway once? High performance requires context. Face-to-face feedback is accountable. Both the sender and the recipient must actively communicate their needs and realities rather than relying on the sterile safety of a numbered continuum on a survey. When you rely on anonymity, you are teaching your employees that honesty is dangerous and must be hidden.
Furthermore, McCord challenges the very vocabulary we use in corporate management. She argues that terms like empowerment and engagement are actually highly problematic.
Yes, and the semantic breakdown of those words is revealing. Empowerment implies that employees were inherently powerless to begin with, and that a benevolent leader is reaching down to grant them agency. I firmly agree with her assertion that employees are not powerless. They are simply limited by bureaucratic structures that prevent them from exploring their capabilities. It is a leader's responsibility to ensure power is exercised and structures are removed, not to artificially grant power as if it were a gift.
And regarding engagement, she notes that the term focuses on measuring an employee's commitment rather than their actual capability and understanding. Someone can be deeply committed, working 80 hours a week and thoroughly engaged, but still lack the specific abilities required for a particular phase of the company's growth. This leads directly to her metaphor comparing a business to a sports team rather than a family.
This metaphor is deeply clarifying, and it is one that many organizations struggle to accept. Countless companies like to call themselves a family. They use it in their recruiting materials and all-hands meetings. But a family implies unconditional membership. You do not fire your uncle because his conversational skills don't perfectly match the quarterly goals.
Right, you're stuck with him.
Exactly, you support him regardless. A business, however, is a sports team. Members are actively chosen based on their performance, their specific skills, and their compatibility with the team's current strategic needs. If an individual is no longer a fit for the team's evolving requirements, terminating their employment is not a failure of engagement, and it shouldn't be stigmatized as an inability. It is simply an incompatibility.
If I am an employee hearing that, it might sound incredibly cutthroat. It implies that my position is only secure as long as I am the absolute best player for that specific position at that exact moment. Doesn't that lack of unconditional support destroy psychological safety?
It destroys the illusion of safety, which is ultimately a kindness. False safety is what leads to the cognitive tax we discussed earlier. When you look closely at this philosophy, it connects deeply to utilitarianism in leadership. Utilitarianism dictates that the optimal action is the one that maximizes social benefits while minimizing social costs. In McCord's framework, delivering hard truths and providing rigorous, face-to-face feedback is the most effective approach. It forces self-realization. If an employee is incompatible with the company's needs, giving them the honest truth allows them to recognize this reality and relocate their agency elsewhere to a place where they can thrive. Keeping them in the dark with half-truths ultimately harms both the individual and the collective.
I want to shift our focus geographically because it's easy to look at a Seattle tech CEO or a Silicon Valley culture deck and assume this cognitive tax is a purely Western hypercapitalist phenomenon. But that is simply not the case. The cognitive toll of inauthenticity is universal, and in fact, the cultural pressure to maintain a flawless professional persona can be amplified dramatically in Asian markets.
I have examined the intense psychological dynamics at play in these markets, and the structural demand for the mask is profound. The concept of saving face is not just a social nicety, it is an ingrained professional currency.
To illustrate this, let me detail the experience of May, a senior analyst working in Singapore. May operated in the high-stakes financial district of Raffles Place, and she lived a profound double life. Professionally, she was the picture of absolute perfection and unshakable competence. She hit every target, navigated complex client relationships flawlessly, and never showed a moment of weakness. But the psychological toll was devastating. Her morning commute routine is incredibly telling. She would sit on the train, staring into the reflection of the window, actively practicing her confident face. She was meticulously training her facial muscles to hide any hint of stress, doubt, or exhaustion before she walked into the office.
That act of practicing a facial expression in a train window is the literal manifestation of the mask we are discussing. It is a physical or psychological lie.
Exactly. She was paying the cognitive tax before she even swiped her badge, and it led to a predictable, catastrophic outcome, total burnout. By investing massive amounts of cognitive energy into protecting her image as the perfect, invulnerable analyst, she actually prevented anyone from offering her genuine support or assistance. She was drowning in the workload and the stress, but she refused to let anyone see her struggle. This is the self-protection illusion. The mask is meant to keep us safe, especially in rigid professional cultures that do not tolerate perceived weakness. But instead of providing safety, the mask creates an inescapable prison of isolation. In environments like Singapore, where there is immense cultural pressure to maintain face, this dynamic destroys psychological safety. It kills productivity because the individual is spending all their energy managing the facade rather than managing the work. True power in these environments requires the immense courage to drop the mask and be seen as human.
To truly understand what happened to May structurally, We must analyze the science behind this specific type of burnout. What May was engaging in is clinically defined as emotional suppression. It is vital to differentiate this from emotional labor. Emotional labor is typically dictated by the external rules of a job, for instance, a flight attendant being required by their employer to smile at passengers, or a customer service representative using a cheerful script. Emotional suppression, however, is a response-based form of coping. It involves a personal, habitual inhibition of the expression of ongoing, genuinely experienced emotions. It is a deliberate choice to hide what one is actually feeling, regardless of corporate policy.
The cognitive cost of this suppression is monumental. It is not just about feeling tired. It is a structural drain on capacity.
It is a massive drain. When individuals like May heavily suppress their emotions, they are actively deceiving others about their true feelings and beliefs. This creates a profound state of inauthenticity. The critical factor here is that suppressing emotions is not a passive state. It requires continuous, active cognitive modulation. Think of it through the lens of conservation of resources theory. Imagine the brain operates like a smartphone battery. Every time you have a genuine emotion, fear, exhaustion, frustration, and you actively choose to suppress it, you're opening a heavy application that runs constantly in the background. The brain must constantly monitor internal feelings and actively suppress their external manifestation. This continuous effort leads to a rapid downward spiral of energy loss. You are bleeding resources just to maintain the illusion of being fine. By the time an actual crisis hits the desk, the battery is at 1%.
This has severe implications for leadership, particularly during a crisis. Let's look at the concept of self-sacrificial leadership, or SSL. During the COVID-19 pandemic, we saw numerous executives at major hospitality brands voluntarily take massive salary cuts to prevent further layoffs or to signal solidarity with their furloughed teams. This is a classic example of SSL. The entire purpose of this leadership style is to provide resources to the employees. The leader sacrifices their own material wealth or comfort to provide material safety, trust, and loyalty to the collective.
That is the intended mechanism. The leader signals, "I am taking the hit so you do not have to," which theoretically builds immense loyalty and perceived effectiveness. However, there is a severe disconnect when you introduce employee emotional suppression into the equation. If an employee, like May, is habitually suppressing their emotions, their cognitive resources are completely exhausted. They are psychologically depleted. Because they are so depleted, they actually become significantly less effective at decoding and appreciating their leader's self-sacrificial behaviors.
Let me make sure I'm understanding the mechanics of this. You are saying that because the employee is spending all their energy pretending they are fine, they literally lack the bandwidth to recognize that their boss is trying to help them.
The cognitive latency we discussed earlier prevents the message from landing. The positive, intended impact of SSL, the increase in perceived leader effectiveness, the building of trust is severely weakened. The leader is making a genuine, painful sacrifice, but the employee is too cognitively exhausted by their own emotional suppression to recognize or benefit from it. The gesture falls into a void.
This means leaders cannot just rely on grand gestures of self-sacrifice. They must also address how their teams are actually coping with the daily reality of the work. This brings us to the contrast between approach coping and avoidance coping. Avoidance coping is when an individual intentionally suppresses their cognitive and emotional reactions to a threat. They ignore the negative feelings. If a leader uses avoidance coping, if they stand in front of their team during a crisis and say, just ignore the negative feelings, don't worry about it, push through the and they fail dramatically. They fail because they are essentially ordering their employees to consume their own cognitive resources to suppress their anxiety. They offer no actual solutions, just a mandate to hide the fear.
Avoidance coping from a leader is essentially a demand that the team pay the cognitive tax on behalf of the organization. Conversely, approach coping is characterized by information awareness, acknowledging the threat, and active problem solving. When a leader combines approach coping with self-sacrificial leadership, the results are structurally powerful. A leader utilizing approach coping stands up and acknowledges the fear. They say, this situation is dire, these are the exact risks we face, and here is how we are going to attack them. They provide emotional support by validating the reality and outline a practical path forward. I have found that this combination drastically increases the perceived effectiveness of the leader. And critically, it reduces what we call negative word of mouth, or NWAM. When employees feel supported by a leader who faces reality rather than avoiding it, their inclination to speak negatively about the organization, even during a severe crisis, is significantly diminished.
To zoom out and look at the structural architecture of this dynamic across the region, I want to detail a massive study analyzing 858 companies across the Asia-Pacific. The sheer scale of this data provides incredible insight. The goal of this research was to understand exactly what builds successful, future-ready teams. The absolute core requirement they identified was psychological safety. This echoes the famous findings from Google's Team Project. Psychological safety is defined as an environment where there is interpersonal trust, mutual respect, and critically, absolutely no fear of embarrassment or punishment for speaking up or admitting a mistake.
In analyzing the data across these 858 companies, I've noted that there are three primary drivers that create this psychological safety. The first is the behavioral integrity of leaders, meaning management actions strictly match their words, and they deliver on their promises without fail. The second is organizational support, which includes tangible practices supporting work-life balance and robust employee development programs. The third driver is relationship networks, which measures management's receptivity to new ideas and the level of genuine personal concern established between individuals.
What makes this study fascinating is how the impact of these three drivers varies wildly depending on the specific cultural context of the country. It is not a one-size-fits-all solution. For example, in Singapore, Australia, and India, relationship networks have the absolute highest impact on creating psychological safety. Connecting this back to May, the analyst in Singapore. She lacked a relationship network entirely because her mask prevented any genuine personal concern or receptivity from taking root. She presented an impenetrable exterior. In those specific cultures, if the interpersonal bonds are weak, psychological safety collapses completely, regardless of how many organizational perks or wellness programs are offered.
The contrast is striking when we look at South Korea and the United Arab Emirates. In those nations, the data reveals that the behavioral integrity of leaders matters most. This is deeply tied to cultural frameworks. These societies have a much deeper ingrained acceptance of power, hierarchy, and institutional collectivism. In highly structured societies, authority is often perceived as absolute. Therefore, the psychological safety of the employee is almost entirely dependent on whether the leader at the top is perceived as honest, ethical, and true to their word. If the leader lacks behavioral integrity, if they say one thing and do another, the entire structure feels fundamentally unsafe because the employee has no lateral recourse. The foundation is cracked at the very top.
And then we look at China, where the findings are somewhat unexpected given historical assumptions. In China, organizational support was found to be the primary driver of psychological safety. While historically seen as a deeply collectivistic culture, the modern workplace in China is being driven by a younger, highly assertive generation of workers. These professionals demand to see tangible organizational perks, clear evidence of work-life balance initiatives and development opportunities before they will commit their loyalty to the collective. They want the organization to prove it supports them structurally before they feel safe enough to take interpersonal risks. It is a highly transactional foundation for safety.
This global perspective on the mechanisms of integrity transitions us perfectly into an examination of the emerging professional class, specifically in the United Kingdom, where the pressures of digital perfection have created a new, highly visible crisis of authenticity. The cognitive tax is no longer just paid in boardrooms, it is paid continuously online.
Let's examine the reality of Callum, a young PR executive working in London. Callum's entire career trajectory was meticulously built on a highly curated digital identity. He was the quintessential rising star on LinkedIn and Instagram, always posting about his successes, his networking events, his profound industry insights. Every update was polished, optimized, and designed to project momentum. But when he made a major, substantive mistake on a client's campaign, a mistake that cost money and required immediate intervention, his first instinct was not to take ownership and fix the problem. His immediate, overwhelming instinct was to hide the mistake to protect his personal brand.
I see this constantly among emerging professionals. They are trapped by the demand for digital perfection. In this ecosystem, genuine integrity, the act of admitting a flaw or a failure, actually feels like a severe career liability. The architecture of the professional life is built entirely on the projection of success.
That is exactly the trap Callum found himself in. He realized that in his world, authenticity had become nothing more than a marketing buzzword, an aesthetic rather than a practice. He was paralyzed, much like the acquaintance I mentioned at the very beginning of our discussion. He was trying to figure out how to spin the failure without damaging his meticulously crafted image. But the weight of the hidden mistake paralyzed him. He couldn't perform his actual job because he was entirely consumed by managing the fallout of the cover-up. His realization was profound. You simply cannot move forward in your career or your life until you stop lying to your followers and, more importantly, to yourself about where you actually stand. He had to learn that accountability, the willingness to own the mistake publicly and face the immediate consequences, is a superpower, not a weakness.
The environment Callum was navigating is brilliantly deconstructed by analysts looking at the current state of professional networking, specifically LinkedIn. The platform has morphed from a relatively dry, functional resume database into what can only be described as an Instagram filter for your career. I find the paradox here deeply troubling from a structural standpoint. If you scroll through the platform, you are presented with a reality where everyone's employer is demonstrably better than yours. Every project is a game changer, and every single person is teeming with aggressive excitement for Monday morning.
It's an environment of relentless, sanitized positivity. If I am an emerging professional comparing my messy, frustrating daily reality to this feed, the cognitive dissonance is immense.
And recently, there's been a shift toward what I call curated vulnerability. Professionals are sharing personal struggles, often citing mental health awareness or discussing a past failure. While the intent to destigmatize mental health is valid, on these platforms, it operates as a highly controlled yin to the yang of a flawless work life. The vulnerability is sanitized, it is overshared, but scrubbed of any real professional consequence. People post about overcoming burnout only after they have secured the promotion. This paradoxical inauthenticity actually dilutes the true self. The danger is acute. If we collectively pretend that our jobs and our employers are always flawless, we eliminate the vocabulary needed to solve actual workplace dysfunctions.
So how do you solve it without committing career suicide?
I advocate for the necessity of occasionally outing your own employer. By this, I do not mean reckless sabotage. I mean acknowledging publicly, or at least internally within your networks, that work is sometimes genuinely maddening and dysfunctional. That acknowledgement is crucial because solving those very problems is the exact reason the company and the jobs exist in the first place. If we pretend the machine is perfect, we render the mechanics obsolete.
The complexity of navigating this digital landscape is highlighted in a recent empirical study focusing on Year 1 social work students at Huddersfield University in the UK. These are emerging professionals whose personal lives, academic requirements, and future professional duties are suddenly colliding online. The study addressed the intense ethical and practical concerns of managing a social media presence, particularly the danger of falling foul of strict conduct policies, like those enforced by the Health and Social Care Professions Council.
I have analyzed the educational approach highlighted in this study, and it points to a critical systemic failure in how we prepare individuals for the digital reality. Currently, institutions provide abstract ethical guidance and detailed, rigid policy documents. They hand students a manual on what not to do. But reading a policy is fundamentally insufficient to prevent naive or ambivalent behavior online. A list of rules does not equip a student to handle the nuanced reality of digital interaction, where the lines between personal identity and professional duty blur instantly.
The paradigm must completely shift. The researchers concluded that we need to stop asking whether social media can or should be used and start teaching exactly how it should be used. This requires the development of deep reflective skills. Students need concrete training on how to interact with service users in a digital space, how to establish boundaries, and critically, how to properly and professionally close down online relationships when they are no longer appropriate. It's about building a framework of practical integrity, not just theoretical ethics. You cannot just tell a student to be professional online without defining the mechanics of what that means when a former client sends a friend request.
As we synthesize the architecture of integrity across all these domains, from Seattle boardrooms managing structural debt, to Asian financial hubs wrestling with the cognitive tax of emotional suppression, to the digital feeds of London demanding curated perfection, we arrive at a set of irrefutable conclusions. I have detailed how honesty cannot be viewed as a mere moral checkbox. It is the fundamental physics of personal power and organizational resilience. Dishonesty in all its forms acts as a shield against accountability. If we do not acknowledge and fix our mistakes, we guarantee structural failure.
It's like a builder who uses low-grade steel in a bridge and hides that fact to protect his reputation and secure the next contract. The facade may look perfect for a while, but the bridge will inevitably collapse under weight. True strength requires looking directly at the low-grade steel in our lives, acknowledging its presence, and doing the hard, unglamorous work to replace it. And to rebuild a foundation of actual strength, there are 3 definitive audits of integrity that must be executed. First is the mirror test. You must confront the specific areas where you lie to yourself about your current progress. You must stop labeling the act of just being busy as working hard.
Second is the conflict test. You must recognize and dismantle the habit of saying yes when you actually mean no, simply because you are trying to avoid a difficult conversation.
And third is the ownership test. You must master the necessity of admitting a mistake completely without attaching a but or a qualifying excuse to the end of the sentence.
Authenticity is the only currency that does not devalue over time. When you operate with absolute honesty, you are grounded, you are stable, and you are unshakably strong. Building a palace on a foundation of sand will always result in collapse. Telling the truth, especially when it's painful and exposes your flaws, is the only environment where real muscle is built.